Today's reading is from Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Jesus at once made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the opposite shore while he dismissed the crowds. After he had sent the crowds away, Jesus went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there by himself. The boat had already gone some distance from the shore and was being smashed around by the waves since the wind was against it. At the very dead of night, he came toward them, walking on the water. The disciples saw him walking on the sea and panicked. "It's a ghost," they said, and they screamed in terror. But Jesus at once spoke to them. "Cheer up," he said, "it's me. Don't be frightened." "If it's really you, Master," said Peter in reply, "give me the word to come to you on the water." "Come along then," said Jesus. Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind, he was afraid and began to sink. "Master," he yelled, "rescue me." Jesus at once reached out his hand and caught him. "A fine lot of faith you've got," he said. "Why did you doubt?" They got into the boat and the wind died down, and the people in the boat worshipped him. "You really are God's son," they said.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's a familiar story, Jesus walking on water and Peter's partly successful attempt to do the same. And we can all relate with Peter, I think, in this. I think the context of this story is important. If we start back at the beginning of chapter 14 in Matthew, we see that the first 12 verses are about the death of John the Baptist. If you remember, Herod, the ruler there, who was given the title by Caesar of King of the Jews, even though he was only half Jewish, and he and his father funded much of the cost of rebuilding the temple, but he was a politician, he was a Roman at heart, and anyway, he had arranged for Herodias, his sister-in-law, to divorce her husband, Herod's brother, and marry him. Herod, this is kind of a convoluted story. Actually, Herod and his brother by another mother both were named Herod. So if you read Josephus's history of this, it's really hard to follow because there's so many, and of course their father's name was Herod also. But anyway, the crux of the story is that this Herod visited his brother's house, got into a relationship with his wife, Herodias, and convinced her to divorce her husband, Herod, and come and marry him. John the Baptist saw this all happening, and he spoke out against this to Herod. Said, "You shouldn't be doing this, this is not lawful." He got thrown into prison as a result of that. And then there was this party, and Herodias' daughter was dancing for the party. It really pleased Herod, and he vowed that he would give her whatever she wanted. She consulted with her mother, Herodias, and her mother convinced her to ask for John the Baptist's head. This grieved Herod, but because he had given his word, his oath, to his stepdaughter, he went ahead and had John executed. So this is the beginning of this chapter, and I think it's important to keep all of these events in mind as we come to Jesus walking on the water. And here's why. In verse 12, we read, his, meaning John the Baptist's disciples, came and took the body, this is after he'd been crucified, and they buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. So John had been publicly speaking out against Herod's immorality, his lawlessness, and this got him thrown into prison, and ultimately it cost him his life. Even though Herod really didn't want to do that, he found himself in a bind. Jesus hears about this from John the Baptist's disciples. So at this point, John the Baptist had disciples, and Jesus had disciples. They were both functioning independently, separately, but there was a connection between the two. John, you remember, had seen Jesus at his baptism, called him the Son of God, recognized that he was the one, Jesus was the one that John was foretelling. But John still had disciples that hung with him, even after the baptism of Jesus. And these disciples come and tell Jesus about his execution. And when Jesus hears about the execution of John the Baptist, what does he do? We see in the next verse, in verse 13, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself." I expect he was going to grieve the death of John. I expected maybe like any of us, when a friend, or John was his cousin, we know from Luke's birth narratives. So Jesus was grieving the death of his cousin, the person he'd called the greatest of all the Old Covenant prophets. I expect he needed some time alone. But he didn't get much time alone, because he went out to be by himself after hearing of John's death. And when the crowds heard about it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When the crowds heard about it, heard what? I always used to read this as when the crowds heard that Jesus went out in the desert, they followed him. But I really don't think that's what it means. If we read these verses together, or all of verse 13 rather, it sounds like this. "Now when Jesus heard this," meaning the description of John the Baptist's execution, "he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns." I think what the crowds heard was about John the Baptist's execution too. The disciples first came and told Jesus about the execution, and he decided he would separate himself. And then when the crowds heard about it, they also followed Jesus. The crowds had gone out to repent and be baptized by John, but now John is dead. Who will they follow? John has been executed by Herod. So all of John's followers, the crowds that had been following John, now are without a leader. Herod, the corrupt, immoral king of the Jews, whom John had been calling out for his immorality, had him executed. So John had been doing what today's religious right and left leaders do all the time, calling out political leaders for what they perceive as their shortcomings, rallying people against political leaders. The question is, who would these people follow now? There was a power vacuum, if you will. The leader of John's disciples, the crowds that had followed him, now were without their leader, without their shepherd. And whenever that happens, a time of chaos typically ensues. Who's going to be the new leader? So they follow Jesus away from the eyes of Herod and the Romans, out into a deserted place. So what do you think they were expecting Jesus to do? Their leader had just been executed by the representative of Rome. I think they expected Jesus to pick up where John left off. I think they expected Jesus to whip them up against their immoral leaders. I think they expected Jesus to lead them in overthrowing Herod and the Romans. And a deserted place is the ideal place to regroup, to organize, and train for a revolution. But what does Jesus do when he sees the crowds coming to him? He saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. This is just weird. Any revolutionary worth his salt at this point would have sought out the strongest, the most able-bodied of men, the most zealous of the crowd, to be his generals, to be his commanders. He would have begun giving speeches that would have united the crowd against Herod and Rome. He would have began dividing the crowds into battalions, saying something like, "Make Israel great again." That would have been the rallying cry. But this is not what Jesus does. He goes immediately to the sick, the weak, the least of the crowd, and cures them. He doesn't use John's execution to whip up anger against Herod and the Romans. He doesn't use John's execution to rally a crowd around himself. He doesn't even mention John. He had compassion for them because they were sick. Physically sick, yes, but also mentally sick. They had been infected with the age-old lie that violence must be responded to with more violence. But Jesus instead recognizes this age-old sickness that inflicts crowds everywhere and at all times, and goes about beginning to heal it. And then after healing them, he feeds them. All of them. 5,000 men, plus the women and the children. Fear of having enough to eat often drives crowds to revolt. But instead of using the crowd's hunger to unify them against Herod, which he could have easily done, instead of leading the revolt, Jesus feeds them himself. He involves his disciples, though, with that. So they take part in this radical new way of thinking about political unrest, about the loss of a leader, about the chaos that ensues, that comes after that. And he brings calm to the chaos that was left in the wake of John's execution. We see this dynamic all the time today. If you follow the news or have most of your life, or if you're a history buff, which I'm really not, you see that often when a country's leader either dies or is killed, a time of chaos follows that because there's a power vacuum left. And so different interest groups are vying to get into power at that point. This is what Jesus could have done. He could have played that role like is played so often. But he didn't. Usually when a strongman type of leader is killed or dies, chaos floods in for a time until some other strongman leader arises to take his place. So those two stories, the description of John the Baptist's death, Jesus going out in the wilderness after he hears this, and the crowds following him after they hear about John's death, and then the ensuing miracle of Jesus feeding them in the wilderness, of not whipping them up into a frenzy against Herod, of not doing what any rational person would assume that the leader to follow John the Baptist would do. Jesus feeds them. This brings us today, up to the text that we're considering today. Immediately then, he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. So in context, this is where we are. He just heard about John's death. He'd fed the crowds. He'd healed the crowds. He didn't act at all like the crowd would have expected him to act in this circumstance. And now he sends his disciples across the sea, the lake, and he dismisses the crowds. He's got no interest in leading a violent overthrow of Herod. He heals and he feeds and dismisses the crowd. That one other story says that he saw it like sheep without a shepherd. David had been their shepherd. They knew all about David, and he had led the Israelites into battle. Joshua had been a type of shepherd, and he led them into battle against the Canaanites. They thought John the Baptist would be that same kind of shepherd and lead them into battle against Rome. But Jesus doesn't do this. He doesn't use the crowds in that way. He heals them, he feeds them, and then he dismisses them. I mean, this is his political party. And he just dismisses them. He lets them leave. He diffuses this volatile situation following John's execution. He calms the chaos that always follows the execution of a leader. He even separates himself from his own disciples, sending them across the lake in a boat while he goes away to pray. Then when evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. Now, I don't doubt that Jesus actually walked on the water. I don't question the historicity of this story. But I also know that the sea is a scriptural metaphor for chaos. In Genesis we see it when the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the waters. It says they were formless and void. They were chaotic. In Job we read about the sea monsters and Leviathan and all of the... So people, the sea was a scary place. I mean, it is a scary place even today. But imagine for people at this time how scary the sea could be. They would have heard all these legends of the sailors being lost at sea to sea monsters, and the sea was interpreted as the place of chaos, that were uncontrollable, immense forces that couldn't be tamed. We also see it in Revelation where it says that the New Jerusalem will have no sea. It doesn't mean there won't be any ocean. It means this New Jerusalem will have no chaos, that all the chaotic nature of human existence will come to an end in the New Jerusalem. So in context, I think Matthew is getting at something deeper than just the physical event of Jesus walking on the water here. When he walks on the sea, there's something more going on. Since the death of John the Baptist, Jesus has been trying to bring about peace in a chaotic situation. And it seems that he knew that his disciples still weren't getting it. So he sends them out to sea, out into the chaos, alone. They're still churning. They're being tossed around. They're unsettled about how different Jesus is than John the Baptist was. About how different Jesus was from their Old Testament heroes like Joshua and David. This could be very disconcerting, very unsettling. The story of the waves kind of illustrates that. Waves of doubt and disillusionment are crashing in over them. They're struggling to make any progress against the chaos. But they'd also taken part in feeding the multitude. This must have been really confusing to the disciples. And in the midst of what must have been a mixture of like confusion and excitement and disillusionment, Jesus comes like a ghost, like an apparition, walking on the sea, unaffected by the chaos, steadfast, yet frightening. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." It can be a terrifying thing to come face to face with Jesus, who is not overwhelmed by our chaos. We rub our eyes because we're not sure we're seeing things right. We want to pull Jesus into our mess, but he steadfastly remains, not above it. He didn't float in the air out to them. He walked on the sea. He remains steadfast, not above it, not aloof, not uncaring, not apart, but also not embroiled in it. He's walking confidently with us in it, through it, yet not tossed about by it. He remains atop the chaos. I've chosen that phrase from my title today because I think this illustrates how Jesus relates to our chaos. He doesn't separate himself from it. He's not the Bette Midler God who sees us from a distance. He's not off in space somewhere just observing us. He's right there at the interface of the divine and the human. Right there on the surface of the chaos, atop the chaos, not apart, not aloof, not uncaring, but right there in contact with our chaos. His response to chaos is so different than ours, we're not sure he's real. It's scary, it's terrifying. But when he sees our fear, he says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answers, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. At this point, Peter's still thinking like a soldier in David or Joshua's army. He says, "If you're really the Messiah, give me a command." Come on, our army leader, give me a command. But Jesus responds as always, not with a command, but with an invitation. Come. Jesus doesn't command us, he invites. And it's not the kind of command Peter might have been expecting, but it's enough. So over the side he goes into the chaos. And he begins to experience the chaos from Jesus' perspective. Atop the chaos. Not separate from it, not aloof from it, in touch with the chaos, but not overwhelmed by it. Atop the chaos. This is where we need to learn to live with Jesus. We're in a time in our culture today where there's a lot of chaos around. And the church and followers of Jesus, I think this is a prescient lesson for us today, to learn where Jesus or how Jesus relates to chaotic situations. He stays atop them, but he doesn't separate himself from them. He doesn't He's not what do they call it, he just doesn't, like the Amish ended up doing, and the Mennonites, they ended up just separating them, separatists. They ended up just separating themselves from society. Jesus didn't do that. He didn't stay back on the mountain praying for them. He went out to meet them, in contact with the chaos, in contact with what they were struggling with, but not himself overwhelmed by it. He didn't allow himself to be sucked down under the waves of their chaos. This is where we need to learn to live today. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" This is really a definition of faith here. And I love this definition. You of little faith, why did you doubt? You could rephrase that as faith is staying atop the chaos. Not separate from it, not aloof, not indifferent, but also not consumed and not overwhelmed by it. Keeping our eyes on Jesus, of course, is the key in this. Not spending too much time focusing on the chaos. Last week we were in Quebec, Matthew and I and my friend John, and we stopped to look at this river called the Heart June River in northern Quebec. I used to whitewater canoe quite a bit. Don't do it so much anymore. My friend John is a little older than me, and he's in much better shape than I am, and he still paddles a lot, and has for decades. And we were looking at this rapid, or really a falls, and considering what canoers and kayaks call lines. What line would you take through this falls? We were looking for lines we might take to paddle or find our way down through this violent piece of water. John reminded me that you always look for a section of dark water, often shaped like a V. So from upstream, you're scanning the rapid as you come into it, and you look for these V's with the point facing away from you, and the water is all dark there. It can be difficult to find those when you're sitting down at water level in a canoe. So sometimes as you're approaching a rapid, you'll even stand up to get a better view, although you don't want to fall over in that position. But you'll often want to get up on top of the water to get a better perspective of what's ahead. The white water, all that white water you see it's kind of like foam on the top of a cappuccino. It's been infused with steam, or in this case with air. So the water that's been infused with lots of air gets all white and foamy like that. The problem is, because it's mixed up with so much air, it won't support the weight of the boat. It won't support your canoe's weight. So chaos is like this. It's a lot of mixed up opinions and emotions, like hot air, creating confusion, and none of it will support you. But Jesus is always there with his hand outstretched, ready to pull us up and out of the chaos, reminding that faith keeps us atop the chaos. It keeps us on those planes of those often like tongues of water. It reminds me of tongues of fire. There's this analogy that kind of goes on and on. This last weekend, if you've watched the news, you've heard about the unrest in Charlottesville, Virginia. White supremacists, Nazis, and KKK and other white racists marched Friday night carrying torches. They were tiki torches, but they were reminiscent of the KKK marches back in the early 20th century. It was a chaotic situation. Saturday, there was at noon, there was a permitted rally that the white supremacists had established for Charlottesville. Before the rally ever got going, there was so much unrest that the mayor canceled the permit for the rally. And that Saturday morning, as I perused some of the news reports and the photos, you would see people like this. This is a counter-protester. So this is somebody who was opposed to the white supremacists, the racists, but here he is with a mask and a helmet and a baseball bat. He's allowed himself to become the mirror image of his opponent. He's taken on Not just their attitudes, but their dress and their armaments. This mirroring invariably leads to violent conflicts or a descent into chaos. These are just some pictures of some of the clashes that were going on. When people mirror their opponents, you end up acting like them. Symbols are perverted. Here's an American flag with a Nazi symbol, a swastika, etched into the middle of the flag. These symbols, these perverted symbols, seek to create offense and animosity, to stir up chaos, to stir up angst. But there is a better way. On the left are a line of clergy all lined up, linked arm in arm. On the right are armed militia. They're not policemen. They're militia members who are there to protect, supposedly to protect the white supremacists, the racists, the Ku Klux Klan members. The clergy are forming a line of peaceful resistance. They're standing atop the chaos. They're not mirroring their opponents, like the man with the helmet and the baseball bat. They're standing atop the chaos. If attacked, they would have turned the other cheek. This is the posture of Jesus walking on water. I'm speaking out about this today because the increase in white supremacy, of racism, is on the rise in our country. And I shared, yesterday I shared a post by Brian Zond on Facebook that read like this: "There are times to call evil for what it is without any equivocation. White supremacists marching with Nazi flags is one of those times." Notice, and Sherry Ann mentioned this morning, that Brian wasn't attacking any people in particular. He's attacking an attitude, an action. He's challenging that action. So somebody immediately commented on my sharing of that post, and he wrote, "Apples for apples, black people marching with ISIS flags is pretty hateful too." Referring, I assume, to a report 2 years ago in Dearborn, Michigan, of a few black people with ISIS flags, although I searched online and I couldn't find any what I would call credible sources to validate that. Now, if that were true, then I wouldn't support that either. But my bigger concern as a pastor is that many, perhaps even a majority of the racist white supremacists that marched in Charlottesville, claim to be Christians. This is my concern as a pastor. It's what Walter Brueggemann was getting at today earlier, that the church has to come to terms with the melding of nationalism in with the gospel. That we have to begin to pull that apart. Because the reputation of Jesus Christ is at stake in this, the reputation of the church. Michael Hill is the president of the League of the South. It's a white supremacist organization in Alabama. And he posted this yesterday, tweeted this: "The League of the South had a good day in Charlottesville, Virginia. Our warriors acquitted themselves as men. God be praised." This is what I mean. This is what we have to call out. I'm repudiating this attitude today because this is not in any way, shape, or form Christian. It has no relationship to the gospel. This is the kind of thinking that led to the Holocaust. It led to the Crusades. It led to the Inquisition. It led to the drowning or burning of witches at the stake. It led to Manifest Destiny, the genocide of American Indians, and countless other horrors where people have co-opted God like Jesus didn't do when the crowds followed him in the wilderness. That was where he could have made his choice. He could have made his choice, but of course he'd already had that temptation in the wilderness with the devil, and he refused it. Here was another chance. This is really another temptation of Jesus, again in the wilderness, this time with a whole crowd of people cheering him on. Come on, Jesus. Be David to us. Be Joshua to us. But he resisted that. He got atop that chaos, and rather than going and rallying the crowd against Herod, he actually went to the lowest common denominator, the people that were sick, and healed them and then fed them, taking away one of their excuses for wanting to revolt against Herod. Messages like this are not Christian, godly, or remotely like Jesus. As a pastor, I repudiate it. I condemn it. This is not Christian. And this is something that the church has to be better at, I believe, in the United States. It has to be better at drawing this line, at separating or calling out people who seek to pull Jesus into their movement to find some validation for their hatred. Jesus doesn't hate anybody. He will not allow himself to be used that way. People will certainly do it, but it's up to us, the members of his body, to just call BS on that when somebody does it. So for discussion today, we can talk about however you want to go. I don't have any particular way I want to go to this. I just wanted to tie this story of Jesus remaining atop. Maybe you have a better word to describe Jesus' position. I wrestled with what to call that. I think it is interesting that Jesus doesn't come floating in the sky. He doesn't come floating out of the clouds to them. He comes in contact with the chaotic situation that they're in. He comes, aware of it, experiencing it, but not allowing himself to be sucked down into it, not allowing himself to be overcome by their chaotic feelings, not allowing himself to become a mirror of his enemies. What does anybody else think about this? Does this make any sense today? Or if you just need to talk about the events of the weekend, that's fine too. Yeah, I'm in it.